talk to visiting professor at the London South Bank University and a co-author of Energize, A Future for Energy Innovation, Professor James Woudhuysen. Good evening, James.
Kevin, good to see you.
Now, Boris is making all these noises, I think, largely because we've got COP26 coming up, or as I like to call it, not much COP26. But if you look at some of the details of what he announced yesterday, I mean, it just seems like pie in the sky. He's talking about securing 440,000 well-paid jobs and unlocking £90 billion of private investment by 2030, which would transform the nation to a low-carbon economy. £620 million for targeted electric vehicle grants and infrastructure, £350 million to boost the electric vehicle supply chain, £625 million to plant trees, $500 million to develop green technologies for the future, and so on and so forth. It all sounds very good, but what it adds up to is a lot of words. And the only potential I can see is for it costing this nation and the taxpayer a great deal of money. What are your thoughts?
Well, Kevin, I think you've summarized the mainstream critique of it. But I think in order to combat what really is a new stage in class war, in fact, because it's class war against the poor. And it's class war against the working class. It doesn't take the old form of employers versus employees, although there's a bit of that. It's really an inflationary prospect that the government wants us to embrace so that they can drive down living standards for those who can't afford those £20,000 heat pumps, while you, as soon as you add in all the servicing costs, the VAT, the installation costs, the new RADs, the new underfloor staff, the maintenance, the repair, and all of that, that is going to hit the normal person in the street very, very hard. Now, if you look at this 365-page document, Kevin, if you'll just let me run you through the numbers.
Don't read every word, James. We've only got 10 minutes.
Going to, no chance. The 440,000 jobs turn up 8 times. The word jobs turns up 240 times. The inflation shows up once as a word. That's a great thing about PDFs. You know, you can search through them. China and Russia show up once, and they apparently are following our lead, right? China and Russia are following our lead.
Can I just interrupt for a second there, James? Yeah. China specifically yesterday, their energy minister and another apparatchik literally took to the airwaves to say that it was absolutely ridiculous to suggest they needed to follow Britain's moral lead, and they wouldn't be doing that. So we can forget about that.
Well, yes, just for once, just this once, I'll agree with the Chinese Communist Party. Right? Yeah. That's just once, right? If I can still run through the numbers, Kevin, because they're really revealing, right? We find that, you know, they strike an anti-immigrant note, of course, because we're going to face mass migration as millions are forced from their homes because of climate change. It's an old Greenpeace, Friends of the Dearth trope. Yeah. And I love Boris referring to that, a friendly Gulf country. Who would that be? Just that he mentioned now, while we're on the international thing. Now, just to conclude, they have 29 mentions of electric vehicles. The phrase used cars, which is what most people buy, appears nowhere in the document. And the Climate Change Committee, headed by Lord Gummer, or Lord Deben, as he likes to style himself, has never considered that. And finally, there are 37 mentions of the word behavior. They want to change your behavior, my behavior, because their behavior is just wonderful, as we know.
Yeah, exactly. Now, there's so much to analyze here, but let's talk about heat pumps for a second. It was described to me yesterday as a woke welfare scheme for the extremely wealthy, which I thought was rather good. Now, the thing about heat pumps is he set aside a lot of money, £400 million, £450 million plus, to offer £5,000 grants to households to replace their gas boilers. And and this will only fund 90,000 homes. So it's a pipe dream to suggest that we'll go anywhere near converting every house to heat pumps. And I found out yesterday that, by the way, heat pumps are not compatible with either terraced houses or flats. So if you live in a flat or a terraced house, and a lot of us do, you cannot have a heat pump. So these are just words. If you start to confront Boris's green dream, what I would call Boris's balmy green dream, with reality, it just falls apart at the seams, doesn't it?
Well, that's true. And, of course, we've got to be very careful if we go by the SAGE experience to imagine that scientists will necessarily, I'm a scientist by training, not anymore, but we'll be very careful to suggest that scientists would do a better job in government. We need elected democratic representatives. Having said that, their ability to add up that of the current government, and indeed Keir Starmer's ability to challenge their figures. I'm not even sure he's reading the PDF. There's no opposition, there's complete media unanimity, and we really have to stand up against this stuff, because we're heading for a class explosion over the next 6 months, right? Some of it depends on the winter, some of it depends on Brussels, a lot of other factors to do with the supply chain. But basically, the figures that you adduce about heat pumps show that, like electric cars, they're for the rich. The subsidies are also for the rich. And the poor and the normal person in the street, you don't have to be poor, is really going to be savaged by all of this.
Don't forget that we are already paying £150 a year green levy on our utility bills to pay for Boris's fantasy projects. And the business secretary the other day warned that there may be another 150 quid a year lumped on us soon. So ordinary people can't afford this. And it does smack, as you suggest, James, of, well-off middle-class politicians just thinking, oh, we'll get everyone to buy a new electric car. Oh, we'll get everyone to put a heat pump in. It'll cost 20 grand, but that's not much, is it? This is the kind of money that ruins people's lives. Ordinary people cannot afford this. So why should we have our lives restricted, made worse, just to fuel Boris's virtue signalling green dream that he wants to shout about at Not Much COP26 next month?
Well, I think that's right. I don't find myself the critique of virtue signaling very persuasive anymore, because the right always uses it. And, if you're on board with all of that stuff, you're not going to be persuaded by that phrase. I understand what you're saying, right? In fact, if you do a bit of history and theoretical work, you'll find that Torsten Veblen, the leftish Norwegian-American economist, in his Theory of the Leisure Class, 1897 or so, I think you'll find, he coined the phrase conspicuous consumption. Now what we've got is conspicuous non-consumption. You flaunt your Tesla, you flaunt your heat pump. I'm a cool guy. And this is the new sort of cultural class war, that there's us, and then there's the, the plebs on the street who don't understand this stuff.
I take your point about virtue signalling, that phrase, it is overused, but I think it's very apposite at the moment, because COP26 next month will be a festival of virtue signalling on the part of Western countries making all the right noises about how awfully green they are. And you mentioned earlier, James, that there's no mention or virtually no mention of China, Russia, Brazil, and all India, all the really bad polluters of the world. And there is the elephant in the room. But once again, to talk about our schemes, Boris's all-consuming green future for us, it doesn't take into account that there's nothing we as a country can do. We only produce 1% of the world's pollution. China not only produces 28% of the world's pollution, but due to its recent announcements that it's going to be building even more coal-fueled power stations in not too distant future, I think it'll probably have about 1,400 coal-fueled power stations. It's also exploring for gas and oil. China's not doing a damn thing to save the planet, not doing a damn thing about the ecology, and frankly, it just does not care. So that it renders COP26, in my view, a festival of pointless, empty virtue signalling by Western nations.
Well, I get it. Again, I would just suggest in a friendly manner a nuance, right? First of all, we have to distinguish between the Chinese Communist Party and China, right? You know, the rulers, there's 95 million members of the party, and there's 1.6 billion Chinese, right? Whether they were consulted or democratically voted for the policy is an entirely different matter, right? Now, the second thing is, of course, they're not following our lead in any way. And in that respect, it is a big sort of flaunting of all of these paper proposals, these legal edicts that Boris comes out with about 5 a day at the moment, rivaling Tony Blair. And, you know, it doesn't mean anything on the ground. I'm not also convinced that the 1% argument is so persuasive either, because just on your program just yesterday, a Mad Green came on and said, well, look, we're responsible for 15% of the fossil fuel investment in the world.
Yeah, there is that.
So I think we have to up our game, right? If we're repeating the same arguments, well, it's not so strong. Okay, now if I may introduce a new one, if you read the document carefully, it also says, you know, because they're nervous about hitting the poor, they make the green point, which we need to come back against, that, you know, climate change will affect the poorest. That's of a piece with their doctrine on mass migration. But you know what they say about how to deal with that? They say that indigenous knowledge systems are the best way to deal with climate change in, you know, underdeveloped countries. In other words, what they're really saying is their view is that a little bit of raffia work or maybe a bit of African dancing, you know, can actually solve a global problem like climate change. I didn't say that, but that's where they're headed. Indigenous knowledge systems. What the heck is that? You mean something that's developed in Streatham?
It's unbelievable.
Dulwich,
it's unbelievable. I just think it's all fantasy. It's all talk.
They're out of touch. Completely out of touch.
Last question. We've only got a couple of seconds left, James.
You're very kind.
But do you feel that Boris, in his heart of hearts, actually believes we're going to achieve net zero by 2050? I'm very dubious about a prime minister in the year 2021 saying no more gas boilers after 2035. What's he going to be doing in 2035? He won't be prime minister. So it's all promises and pledges about something that will be way past his time. Do you think in his heart of hearts he really believes all of these pledges?
Well, a very good question. I think in 2035, he'll be an unelected Lord, if we've still got the Lords, that is. I'm hoping that, you know, the popular revolt will dispose of that, a thoroughly undemocratic institution. Does he believe it? Again, I think we've got to be careful, right? That the glib critique, not you, would say, you know, oh, it's all cynical. He's only doing it for the money. All this woke stuff is just to get a larger market share and all of that, right? I think they do believe it, because the younger generation, which they have trained, is critical of their parents today. And the parents feel the heat. And the parents believe that capitalism hasn't been that great, even when they eliminated the Soviet Union, really, in 1989. So let's not go into their motives, right? Let's take it at face value just this once, right? And show that we've got a new form of class struggle now, which is around culture. It's around censorship. It's around COVID, with big news today about that. And it's about energy, you know, really inflation.
Yeah, it's we're going into a brave new world, or perhaps it's not so brave. James, great to talk to you.
We'll be brave. We'll be brave. You know, you'll be brave.
I'll be brave. You'll be brave. Will Boris be brave? That's the question. Professor James Woudhuysen, visiting professor at London South Bank University. Thank you.